Before we dive into these chilling tales, I have a quick question for you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know. It's always interesting to see how far these stories travel. Now settle in, maybe dim the lights if you dare, and prepare for 3 disturbing true mermaid encounter stories that I personally experienced. You may think of mermaids as mythical, beautiful creatures, but what I encountered was far from the fairy tales you know. It was the summer of 2017, and I was on a much-needed vacation with some friends. We had rented a cabin by the coast, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The cabin sat at the edge of a small cliff, overlooking a wide stretch of ocean. From the porch, you could hear the waves crashing against the rocks below, the sound echoing through the quiet nights. We thought we had found paradise. On our second night, after a day spent swimming and fishing, we decided to have a small bonfire by the water. We gathered driftwood, set up some chairs, and settled in as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, with a light breeze brushing against our skin. It was peaceful, the perfect end to a perfect day. That's when I first heard it, a faint melody, carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the ocean playing tricks on my ears. But as the night wore on, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just random noise, it was a song, haunting and beautiful. I couldn't understand the words, but it felt like it was calling to me. I glanced at my friends, but no one else seemed to notice the music. They were laughing, toasting marshmallows, completely oblivious. I tried to ignore it, to push the strange feeling away, but the song kept tugging at me. It was as if something, or someone, was beckoning me to the water. Against my better judgment, I steered the found towards the shore. The closer I got to the ocean, the louder the song became. It was mesmerizing, and before I knew it, I was standing at the water's edge, staring out into the dark waves. I felt a strange compulsion to step into the water, to follow the voice. My feet were already sinking into the wet sand when I snapped out of it. What was I doing? I turned around quickly and made my way back to the fire. My heart was pounding and my mind raced with questions. What had just happened? Why had I felt so drawn to the water? I didn't say anything to my friends. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to take a walk along the beach. The tide was low and the rocks that were usually submerged were now exposed, creating small pools of water where tiny creatures swam about. I found myself wandering towards a rocky outcrop a little farther down the coast, away from the cabin and my friends. I don't know why, but something about that area intrigued me. As I approached, I noticed a figure sitting on the rocks, her back to me. At first, I thought it was just another person enjoying the morning, but as I got closer, I realized something was off. Her skin had an odd shimmer to it, almost like scales, and her long, flowing hair seemed to merge with the water. My heart started to race. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. She turned her head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face. She wasn't human, not entirely. Her eyes were too large, her features too sharp. She looked like something out of a nightmare. Before I could react, she smiled and dove into the water, disappearing beneath the waves. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. Was it real, or had I imagined the whole thing? I didn't know what to think. That night, the song returned. It was louder this time, more insistent. I tried to block it out, but it was useless. It filled my head, drowning out all other thoughts. I felt the same pull, the same urge to go to the water. But this time I wasn't alone. My friends had noticed my strange behavior and were growing concerned. They tried to talk to me to figure out what was wrong, but I couldn't explain it. How do you tell someone that you're being lured into the ocean by a creature that shouldn't exist? Eventually, they decided to stay up with me, to keep me away from the water. But the song, it was relentless. It wouldn't stop until I answered its call. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. Without saying a word, I stood up and walked out of the cabin, my friends shouting after me. I don't remember much after that, just fragments. Cold water, the taste of salt, and a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the deep. I woke up in the hospital the next morning. According to my friends, they had found me unconscious on the beach, half submerged in the water. The doctors said I had suffered from hypothermia and exhaustion, but I knew that wasn't the whole story. Something had pulled me into the ocean that night, something far more dangerous than I could have imagined. We cut our vacation short and returned home. I haven't been back to that beach since, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear that song in the back of my mind. I'll never forget the call of the deep. In the spring of 2019, I decided to take a trip to a remote coastal village in Eastern Europe. I had heard about it through a travel blog, a small, picturesque town with old stone buildings and narrow cobblestone streets. It sounded like the perfect place to escape for a while and clear my head. When I arrived, I was struck by how quiet the village was. There were people around, but they kept to themselves, their eyes downcast, moving quickly through the streets. It was as if they were afraid of something, though I couldn't figure out what. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just a cultural difference. After all, I was a foreigner in a strange land. I checked into a small inn at the edge of the village overlooking the sea. The room was quaint, with an old-fashioned charm, and the view was breathtaking. But there was something unsettling about the place. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and at night I could hear strange sounds coming from the water, low, mournful wails that echoed through the darkness. I asked the innkeeper about the noises, but he just shook his head and muttered something in a language I didn't understand. When I pressed him further, he became agitated and told me to stay away from the water after dark. His tone was stern, almost fearful, and it sent a chill down my spine. I decided to follow his advice for the most part, but curiosity got the better of me. One evening, just before sunset, I ventured down to the shore. The beach was deserted, the water calm and still. I wandered along the shoreline, admiring the beauty of the landscape, when I noticed something odd in the distance, a cluster of old, weathered ruins, half submerged in the water. Intrigued, I made my way over to the ruins. As I got closer, I realized that they were the remains of buildings, their stone walls worn smooth by the waves. It looked like an entire village had once stood there, now swallowed by the sea. The sight was eerie, but also fascinating. I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the people who had lived there. That night, the wailing from the water grew louder, more desperate. It sounded like someone, or something, was crying out for help. I tried to sleep, but the noise kept me awake, filling me with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I tossed and turned in bed, my mind racing with thoughts of the drowned village and the mystery that surrounded it. In the early hours of the morning, I heard a faint knocking on my window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the knocking persisted, growing louder and more insistent. I got out of bed and approached the window cautiously. When I pulled back the curtains, my heart nearly stopped. There, standing in the shallow water just beyond the inn, was a figure. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but I could see enough to know that it wasn't human, at least not entirely. The figure's skin was pale and slick, with webbed hands that reached out towards me. Its eyes were hollow and dark, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. I stumbled back from the window, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, but deep down I knew better. The village wasn't just drowned, it was cursed. The next morning I decided to leave the village. I packed my bags and headed to the bus stop, eager to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But as I waited for the bus, I overheard a conversation between two locals. They were speaking in hushed tones, glancing around nervously as they talked. I couldn't understand their language, but I caught a few words that I recognized, words that sent a shiver down my spine. Mermaid, curse, and revenge. It all started to make sense. The ruins I had seen weren't just remnants of an old village. They were the remnants of a tragedy that had left behind a vengeful spirit. As the bus pulled up, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been lucky to escape with my life. Whatever haunted that village wasn't done. It was still out there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander too close to the water. I never spoke about my experience in the drowned village. It seemed too unreal, too terrifying to share with anyone. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear the wailing of the mermaid echoing in my mind. It's a sound that I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. In the fall of 2020, I was working on a small fishing boat off the coast of a remote island in the Pacific. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and I enjoyed the solitude of the open water. The crew was small, just me, the captain, and 2 other deckhands. We spent our days hauling in nets and our nights anchored off the coast, far away from civilization. One evening, as we were finishing up for the day, I noticed something strange in the water. It was a dark shape, just beneath the surface, moving slowly towards the boat. At first, I thought it was just a large fish or maybe a shark. But as it got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The shape rose out of the water, revealing a figure with long, flowing hair and eyes that seemed to glow in the fading light. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one, but there was something off about her. Her skin had an unnatural sheen to it, and her movements were too fluid, too graceful for a human. She stared at me for a moment, her eyes locking onto mine, and then she disappeared beneath the waves. I stood there, frozen in place, unsure of what I had just seen. The captain noticed my hesitation and called out to me, asking if everything was okay. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. That night, as we lay anchored off the coast, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the figure I had seen in the water, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. What was she? A mermaid? A siren? I didn't know, but I had a sinking feeling that whatever she wasn't friendly. Around midnight, I heard a strange noise coming from the water, a low melodic hum that sent chills down my spine. I got out of my bunk and made my way to the deck, where I found the captain standing at the rail, staring out into the darkness. He didn't say anything, but I could tell from the look on his face that he had heard it too. The other deckhands soon joined us, and we all stood there in silence, listening to the eerie song that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way, but it also filled me with a sense of dread. I knew deep down that we were in danger. The next morning we set out early, hoping to put as much distance between ourselves and the island as possible. But as we sailed farther out to sea, the weather began to change. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind picked up, turning the calm waters into churning waves. The captain ordered us to prepare for a storm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a natural occurrence. It felt like something, or someone, was trying to stop us from leaving. The siren's song echoed in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder if we had angered her by coming too close to her territory. As the storm grew stronger, the boat rocked violently, and we struggled to keep it under control. The waves crashed against the hull, and the wind howled in our ears, drowning out all other sounds. But beneath the chaos, I could still hear the siren's song, growing louder and more insistent with each passing minute. The storm raged on for hours, and by the time it finally began to subside, we were exhausted. The boat had taken a beating, and we were all soaked to the bone, but we were alive. We thought we had made it through the worst of it, but we were wrong. As the clouds began to clear, we saw something in the distance, another boat, drifting aimlessly in the water. It was an old fishing vessel, much like ours, but it looked abandoned. The sails were tattered, and the hull was covered in barnacles, as if it had been lost at sea for years. The captain decided to investigate, hoping to find survivors or at least salvageable supplies. We boarded the boat cautiously, our footsteps echoing through the empty decks. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay, and there was an eerie silence that hung over the place. We searched the boat from top to bottom, but there was no sign of the crew. It was as if they had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. The captain found the ship's log in the captain's quarters, and as he read through it, his face grew pale. He handed the log to me, and I quickly skimmed through the entries. The last entry was dated 2 years ago, and it described an encounter with a strange creature in the water, something that sounded eerily similar to the siren I had seen. The log ended abruptly with a single chilling sentence: "She's coming for us." We didn't stick around to find out what had happened to the crew. We gathered what supplies we could and returned to our own boat, eager to put as much distance between ourselves and that cursed vessel as possible. But as we sailed away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped. The siren's song still echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that she was out there, watching, waiting. The rest of the crew seemed to feel it too. There was an unspoken tension that hung over the boat, a sense of impending doom that none of us could shake. We sailed in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, listening for the siren's song. That night, as we lay anchored far from shore, I heard it again, the same haunting melody, drifting through the air like a lullaby. I got out of my bunk and made my way to the deck, where I found the captain standing at the rail, staring out into the darkness. This time he wasn't alone. One of the deckhands was standing beside him, his eyes glazed over as if he were in a trance. The captain tried to snap him out of it, but it was too late. Before we could react, the deckhand climbed over the rail and jumped into the water, disappearing beneath the waves. We searched for him for hours, but it was no use. He was gone, swallowed by the sea, just like the crew of the abandoned boat. The captain was devastated, blaming himself for what had happened. But I knew it wasn't his fault. The siren had taken him, just as she had taken the others. The next morning, we set sail for the nearest port, determined to get off the water as soon as possible. But the siren's song still lingered in the air, a constant reminder that we weren't safe. We had angered something ancient and powerful, and she wasn't going to let us go without a fight. As I recount these stories to you, I can't help but wonder, are there more creatures out there, lurking in the depths of the ocean, waiting to be discovered? I may never know for sure, but one thing is certain: mermaids aren't just beautiful mythical creatures. Sometimes they're the stuff of nightmares. So, wherever you are, stay safe and be careful the next time you find yourself near the water. You never know what might be lurking beneath the surface, waiting to drag you down into the deep. Which of these stories scared the hell out of y'all? Comment below, and see you on another story.